quick note before we start. This video is for education and entertainment, and it's built on a genuinely alarming stack of research. All right, let's dig. Imagine I handed you a few small seashells, each with a neat little hole punched through it, worn smooth as if they'd been strung together. You'd probably think beads, a necklace maybe. Nothing remarkable. Now imagine I told you those beads were made and worn around 75,000 years ago in a cave in South Africa, tens of thousands of years before anyone painted the famous caves of Europe. Suddenly those humble shells become one of the most important discoveries in the entire story of the human mind. Because a bead is not just decoration. A bead might be one of the earliest hard proofs that a creature had crossed the threshold into being fully symbolically human. The cave is called Blombos, on the southern coast of South Africa, overlooking the Indian Ocean. Excavations there have produced finds that quietly demolished a very Eurocentric idea about when human beings woke up. The dominant story held that modern human behaviour, art, symbols, the fully modern mind, burst into existence in Europe around 40,000 years ago. Before that, humans were anatomically modern, but somehow not yet behaviourally modern. Same bodies, but the lights weren't fully on inside. Blombos said, "Think again and look south and look much further back." At Blombos, researchers found shells of a small sea snail, deliberately perforated and showing wear from having been threaded and worn, dated to around 75,000 years ago. Why does that matter so much? Because a personal ornament is a symbol, and symbols are the signature of the modern mind. A bead worn on the body doesn't do anything practical. It doesn't cut or dig or kill or keep you warm. Its entire function is to mean something, to signal. It might say, "I belong to this group. I have this status." That signalling only works if everyone shares the code, if the whole community agrees that this arrangement of shells stands for that idea. An agreed-upon code of meaning is essentially the same cognitive machinery that underlies language, ritual, and culture itself. When you find deliberate personal ornaments, you're finding evidence of a mind that thinks in symbols and a society that shares them. You're finding us. But Blombos didn't stop at beads. It produced something even more striking, engraved ochre. Researchers found pieces of ochre deliberately marked with cross-hatched geometric patterns. One famous piece has a neat intentional lattice, dated to around 77,000 years ago, an abstract repeated geometric design, a deliberate act of making a mark for its own sake. It's the hand obeying an idea. Some researchers considered these among the oldest known abstract designs made by humans. Someone back then had the urge to impose a pattern on the world, purely because the pattern meant something or pleased them. That is a profoundly modern impulse. And then there's my favourite find, a complete toolkit for making and storing paint, including 2 abalone shells used as containers, with the residue of a processed ochre-based pigment mixture still inside. A 100,000-year-old paint workshop. Making that pigment required gathering ochre, combining it with bone and charcoal and liquid binder, processing it and storing the result. A multi-step, planned, recipe-like process. It shows planning, chemistry, and an investment of effort into something whose purpose was almost certainly symbolic. These weren't primitive beings stumbling toward humanity. They were fully modern minds, mixing paint to a recipe 1,000 centuries ago. And Blombos doesn't stand alone. At Diepkloof, researchers found ostrich eggshell fragments engraved with repeated geometric patterns. Different site, different material, same deep impulse, to mark an object with a deliberate, meaningful design. Something was happening across this whole region, deep in time. Minds that decorated, that marked, that shared codes of meaning. The African dawn wasn't one candle in one cave, it was lights coming on across a continent. There's a fascinating wrinkle. These signs of modern behaviour seem to flicker, showing up in some periods, then fading, then reappearing. One explanation. Complex culture has to be taught and shared across generations, and that's much easier in a larger population. When populations shrank, knowledge could be lost, not because anyone got less intelligent, but because there weren't enough people to keep passing the torch. Whether a culture looks advanced can depend less on intelligence and more on how many people there are and how connected. And think about what the beads implied about connection. Some shells came from sources that weren't right outside the cave. They were carried or exchanged across distances. A bead network is a social network. It hints at contact between groups, at trade or gift-giving. Symbols on the body and objects moving between bands are two halves of the same thing, a species building webs of shared meaning. That's the deep root of everything from trade to religion to nations. Let's zoom out. Beads for signalling, engraved abstract designs, a sophisticated paint workshop, all in Africa, tens of thousands of years before the European creative explosion. Modern human behaviour did not switch on suddenly in Ice Age Europe. It emerged gradually, deep in Africa. We didn't become behaviourally human after we left Africa. We were already fully human when we were still there. We carried the modern mind with us out of the continent. We didn't acquire it somewhere along the way. There probably wasn't a single moment of awakening. It was more like a sunrise, gradual, uneven, spreading. Blombos is one of the clearest windows we have into that long African dawn. The honest caveat. Interpreting these finds is not simple, and researchers argue about them. Could the pierced shells have served some function we're not imagining? Debate is healthy and ongoing. But the sheer accumulation, beads and engravings and a paint workshop layered across tens of thousands of years, is very hard to explain away. It's not a single spectacular object. It's a whole pattern of behaviour stacked up in the layers of one coastal cave. It wasn't only our species doing this. Neanderthals were also making personal ornaments, pierced shells, eagle talons, pigments. The capacity for symbolic thought may not be unique to Homo sapiens. It may be a deeper inheritance, shared with at least one other kind of human. The lights were coming on across the whole family tree, not just our corner of it. There's something deeply human about those beads. Think about what wearing a bead actually is. It's caring how you appear to others. It's marking yourself as belonging, or different, or beautiful. It's an act of identity, of vanity even, of wanting to be seen a certain way by other people whose opinions you care about. 75,000 years ago, on a beach in South Africa, someone strung tiny shells together and wore them and cared how they looked. That's not an abstraction. That's a person you would recognise. Across all that time, that one small human wish, to be seen, to belong, to adorn oneself, reaches out and touches something you probably felt this very morning. So the next time someone tells you that human culture began in the caves of Ice Age Europe, you can point them south and back to Blombos, to the pierced shells and the cross-hatched ochre and the 100,000-year-old paint set. The modern human mind was born in Africa, long before we spread across the earth, and some of the earliest proof of it is a handful of little beads that someone once was proud to wear. All the sources are in the description: the Blombos beads, the engraved ochre, the pigment workshop, and the debates around them. Go read them, and go look at the crosshatch. It's older than you can really feel, and it was made by a hand very much like yours. And remember, the person who wore those shells is your family, and they cared how they looked, just like you. So stay curious about the long dawn we came from, and keep digging. See you in the next one. Bye. For a long time, the dominant story held that the creative explosion around 40,000 years ago in Europe was the birth of the modern mind. Blombos demolished that idea. Look south and look much further back. A bead worn on the body doesn't do anything practical. Its entire function is to mean something. An agreed-upon code of meaning carried on the body is essentially the same cognitive machinery that underlies language, the engravings. A doodle that reaches across 77,000 years to tell us someone had the urge to impose a pattern on the world, making the pigment required gathering, combining, processing, storing. A multi-step recipe 100,000 years old. At Diepkloof, ostrich eggshell containers engraved with geometric patterns. Different site, same impulse. When you find the same symbolic behaviour independently across multiple sites, you can't wave it away as a fluke. Complex culture has to be taught and maintained across generations, easier in larger, connected populations. The capacity for modern behaviour may have been present far earlier than the flickering evidence suggests. A bead network is a social network, contact between groups, trade or gift-giving, relationships across the landscape. We carried the modern mind with us out of Africa. We didn't acquire it somewhere along the way. It was more like a sunrise, gradual, uneven, spreading, with full modern behaviour slowly filling in over tens of thousands of years. Any one find you might explain away? All of them together paint a portrait of full behavioural modernity in Africa. Neanderthals were also making ornaments. The capacity for symbolic thought may be a deeper inheritance. The lights were coming on across the whole human family tree. Wearing a bead is caring how you appear. It's identity, vanity, wanting to be seen. That one small human wish, to be seen, to belong, reaches across 75,000 years and touches something you felt this morning. The modern human mind was born in Africa. Some of the earliest proof is a handful of beads someone was proud to wear. Go look at the crosshatch. It was made by a hand very much like yours. Someone strung tiny shells together and wore them and cared how they looked. That's a person you would recognise. Symbols on the body and objects moving between bands are two halves of the same thing. A species building webs of shared meaning. What came and went was the population density needed to sustain and display complex culture. The crosshatch is older than you can really feel, an abstract pattern, 77,000 years old. The paint set is dated to around 100,000 years ago. Fully modern minds, mixing paint to a recipe. The person who wore those shells is your family. Stay curious about the long dawn we came from. Keep digging. See you in the next one. Bye.